What I'm going to do in my allotted time, which I may not stick to as well as James, so flag me if I need it, is to talk a little bit about primarily the Global Compact for Migration, but a little bit also talking about the Global Compact for Refugees, its formation, and in particular, the way in which it has or has not represented a set of gains towards protecting the labor and human rights of the 281 million international migrants in 2020, of which 135 million or 48% are women. So I'm going to focus primarily on discussing around gender and the way in which the compacts have addressed gender, and specifically about protecting the rights of women and LGBTQ+. So I come to this from talking around, from doing work, roughly 10 years of participant observation at UN Global Forum for Migration, leading up to the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, including Global Forum on Migration Development, High-Level Policy Forum, High-Level Dialogue, etc. So it comes from being embedded in, being engaged in, and politically active in, which is, I think, important to recognize, the formation of the compact, the Global Compact for Migration specifically. And it comes also from an analysis of policies, of the documents themselves, content analysis of the documents themselves, as well as a database that I've created of around 600 bilateral agreements. So that's sort of backdrop there. Overall, I'm hoping that I'll get to the place that I can convince you that there's been some tangible gains, but there's still some sizable gaps with respect to ensuring gender responsiveness and a rights-based approach to the global governance of international migration, as it is such a nascent and emerging infrastructure or apparatus. Basically, I hope to make the case for a feminist international migration policy approach when we're done here. So basically, I'm going to start with some facts. So there were 18 months of negotiations towards the GCM, of official processes, and well over 10 years in the making. There was a handful of NGOs that were really engaged on gender and women and the rights of women. They often did so from the cheap seats, I can attest to that, and often having to keep their elbows up to share the floor with the private sector. So what's happened is, during this time of this negotiation of the Global Compact for Migration, which was largely brought about because of the identification of a number of key gaps, and that there really isn't a sort of a global governance structure around addressing some of those gaps at the international level. And increasingly, that space has been occupied by the private sector. So now civil society is sharing it wholeheartedly with the private sector. There's also, the number of states that have signed on to the GCM. We have 152. The GCR, we have 181. The numbers of mentions of gender responsiveness in the Global Compact for Migration are quite significant to note as well. There's a guiding principle specifically on gender responsiveness in addressing and moving forward with anything to do with gender governance, gender policy, and all of the implementation of the GCM. There's 21 mentions of gender responsiveness in the final version. However, it started out not quite that way. The zero draft, or the first draft, had 10 or 12 mentions, of gender responsiveness, and ended up with 21. Whereas the Global Compact for Refugees only had 4 mentions of gender responsiveness. The number of mentions of LGBTQ+ and LGBTQ+ rights, 0. The number of mentions of sexual and reproductive health rights, also 0. Didn't start out that way. In the New York Declaration, there was representation and focus on that issue. It got dropped through negotiation. Mentions of gender equality, 6. Mentions of violence against women, sexual exploitation, 10. Mentions of trafficking, 24. So while there were some pretty big gains in terms of recognizing a number of areas, there's also been some pretty clear losses throughout the negotiation process. And in particular, in terms of moving away, or sort of gaps, some really big gaps in terms of sexual and reproductive health care, and in terms of recognizing the rights of LGBTQ+. Those are some big gaps. There's quite a lot of others as well, but those two stand out as some pretty significant evidence of backsliding in terms of the gains made in previous decades towards the human rights framework. We have the Beijing Declaration. There's been a whole lot of movement towards having sexual and reproductive health rights recognized, and it got wiped clean off, for example. Both compacts tend to adopt a binary conception of gender, and I think that that's been clearly played out by states basically moving away very quickly from having any reference to LGBTQ+ into the document, despite there being, lots of recognition about homophobic, transphobic violence and all sorts of issues facing LGBTQ+ people on the move. So while it's pretty laudable that the Global Compact for Migration does make an explicit call for moving away from addressing migrant women primarily through the lens of victimhood, so not just sort of thinking of women as represented as the victims so far, but it's also about there is still a tendency to think of gender and gender responsiveness as code for women. And ends up also, peppered throughout the document, often in a kind of add women and stir way, adding on in a gender responsive manner after the end of a paragraph. This is particularly noticeable in the Compact for Refugees, where we see it inserted in a couple of places. Overall, I think the Refugee Compact addresses or understands gender primarily through identifying women and girls as a group with specific needs and flagging them as a need of particular support. And also adding a lot of phrases, including women, especially for girls, as sort of priority action areas. And so this kind of 1980s women in development approach, this add women in stir, gets replicated throughout the document. And in the end, we end up with a document with a lot of reference to gender responsiveness. In the case of the compact, we still stick with the term quite often gender sensitive. And it's sort of tied to the sort of early predecessor of gender mainstreaming. And then now what's become the sort of gender responsiveness way of speaking, which I would argue most states don't really understand still. What we've ended up with is both compacts, in my view, have missed the opportunity for a more transformative approach to really address the gaps in this emerging regime of global governance of international migration. So I think we see this in clear connection to the gender structures of labor migration, something that I focus on in my work. A lot of, there's sort of a lack of attention of the need for skills recognition, and that regular pathways need to be unpacked in terms of the way in which they produce and reproduce gender inequality. In the end, the Global Compact, as I said, also called for gender responsive bilateral regional labor mobility agreements. And I think in many ways that this may prove to undermine the gender responsiveness that's throughout the document, because there's really no getting outside of the realities of the fact that the way in which labor migration in particular has been governed is producing as well as responding to gender inequality. And it's reproducing that gender inequality. And in fact, the status quo has prevailed in the compacts as well. Overall, I think the adherence to the status quo of labor migration governance mechanisms, these use of bilateral agreements, does fail to recognize the limited and often restricted pathways into gendered occupations, recognizing the issues around de-skilling, devaluation of work carried out by women migrants. And overall, I think neglects the very global political economy that structures labor migration, the care economy in particular. Both of the compacts could have paid much more attention to promoting the recognition and elimination of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. I think there's a real failure to recognize intersectionality in the documents. And a number of things were negotiated away. So for example, EU 27 states had called for an end to sex-specific migration bans and for a paragraph on gender discrimination explicitly. Russia, China directly opposed this, and so it didn't find its way into the third draft. And so this is an example of the way in which in debate and in dialogue, there were some gains made, but then some things had to fall off the table. So the Canadian government, for example, was there pushing initially for sexual and reproductive health rights, but it fell off the table in part because of the efforts of countries like Pakistan and the Holy See. So we see that while there's a general language around the human rights-based approach, and it certainly is meant to be grounded and refers back to human rights instruments, there's still these huge gaps in terms of recognizing rights, and certainly nothing around sort of more transformative. So I want to get a bit beyond the discursive level of the compacts into the more structural level in my remaining 5 minutes, roughly. In looking at the emerging structure of the UN network on migration, the number of working groups that are focused on gender in the first phase of the establishment of the UN network on migration, 0. The number of references to gender in the initial document of the establishment of the network. Oh, wait, sorry, they're not 0. They were all in the appendices or in the annex. The number of UN agencies focused on women that are part of the executive body, 0. The number of UN agencies on women and gender that are part of the multi-partner trust fund, which is the trust fund that will basically adjudicate and administer projects and funded initiatives using funds to help develop and implement the Global Compact for migration. We do have UN Women on that committee, on that trust fund board. And this is important. And I think it's important to note that they were not part of and still are not part of the executive, despite the fact they used to be chairing the preceding global migration group. The number of projects that were pitched to the fund were 90 in the first round, and funded projects that went ahead that had UN Women as partners were only 3. So I think the number of governments that are clear on what gender responsiveness actually means in practice don't maybe have the evidence on that, but I would probably say maybe 3, with Sweden and Canada certainly being in that role. So the current structure of the core group of agencies does neglect a role of the only UN organization focused on gender. Civil society is embedded to some extent in the functioning of the UN network on migration, with the role of a civil society liaison, only 1. But they have done a fair bit to try to extend and involve civil society, which is really important when we think about the role civil society has had over time in getting gender and women's rights considerations into UN fora. In fact, many have credited the formation of ILO domestic workers conventions on the activism and engagement of civil society. So we have this multi-partner trust fund, supposed to have a funding goal of 25 million, but it's not clearly resourced. Gender responsiveness, there's no gender-based evaluative criteria that's made, that's really being utilized to determine these. And there's no focus on trying to really push the gender responsiveness into action. This is why, and I think there's been growing concern among civil society that the language might be language alone, and we're not further than we were with the Millennium Development Goals to basically drop those and move on. I think there's still a paucity of understanding about how to move from ideas to action in the network, particularly around gender. And so there's been a move to develop a new thematic area on gender, and it's now become the thematic area on discrimination, but it's an important first step. And I think what I wanted to end on was pointing to the fact that, the gaps in the discourse in the document are one thing, but we can't have Foucauldian blinders on when we think about the structural realities that have been left untouched in the creation of this new infrastructure led by the UN Network on Migration. And I think we've still seen from the 70s and 80s the idea that you have a way to structure migration in such a way where binaries are still largely pervasive. So we need new incarnations from the gender mainstreaming, gender sensitive, gender responsive. And now I think it's time to move past those terminologies that have been largely eviscerated in their usefulness. And we really need to move towards feminist migration governance. And this borrowing from the feminist foreign policy domain to really trying to avoid those trappings of just adding women, but moving on to those where gender is not just the code for women, what Annika Bergman-Rosman has referred to as gender cosmopolitanism, but instead arguing for moving beyond the incorporation of women just in the add women in STIR approach to actually tackling meaningfully the gender inequality that is emerging and that continues to be reinforced in the way in which the system is structured. I think it's time to echo the calls and have feminist foreign policy and push the gender responsive rhetoric into reality.